At the time of the conversation you're about to hear, we are winding down the year 2020, and what a year it has been. I can't wait until we turn the page, see some sort of a virtual ball drop, and begin 2021, because it's going to be really tough for 21 to be as challenging as 2020 was. Let's hope it doesn't come anywhere close. But our guest today is a gentleman who has focused his life on mental health and finding the bright spots in an otherwise dim world at times. And so I'm happy to welcome onto the show the host of the Choose Your Struggle podcast, Jay Shifman. And it's the first time, Jay, you and I have been able to chat and communicate. So it's good to see you. How are you, man?
Well, Bill, this is an honor. Thank you so much for having me. It's always great to chat issues of mental health, substance misuse, all the things that I do. But you know, when people give me the opportunity, I'm incredibly thankful because, unfortunately, there's still a lot of stigma around these topics. And so when people like you open up their platform and say, come on, let's have these sometimes difficult conversations, I'm incredibly thankful. So really just happy to be here and happy to be chatting with you.
Well, in the introduction, I mentioned that we really are rounding out a year that for a lot of people will be one they would be very happy to forget. You know, the old movie Men in Black where they wave the little device in front of the eyes. I think we would all kind of sign up for that thing just to wipe out 2020 for the most part. What have you seen by way of mental health that maybe popped onto the scene in 2020?
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. I was chatting with a reporter for a story yesterday, and the goal of this story was how people who have mission-driven entrepreneurial projects like mine got more in touch with their why in 2020, because it's been a year where if you didn't pivot, you were going to be left behind because things were changing daily, you know, weekly, monthly. What I was doing yesterday probably isn't going to work today. That's just how 2020 has been. And one of the things I told her was that early on, I was nervous, like everybody else. You know, my background is mostly public speaking, at least with this business that I'm running now. And in the week that the NBA shut down, which is kind of when we all recognized that COVID really flourished, I lost 5 speaking engagements in 2 days. And that's when I went, oh no, like this is going to be really bad. Now, luckily for me, I started my podcast about a month before that because I saw the writing on the wall, but I still wasn't like everybody else. I still wasn't prepared for this. And so after a couple of days of mourning and of being really worried, I said, you know what? I'm just going to get back to what I do best, and that is being there for people, helping people. And I put up on all my social media, on my podcast, everywhere. If you need somebody, if you just need someone to talk to, give me a call, find me at my website, all that kind of stuff, right? And that's one of the little parts of my business is I do one-on-one coaching. I do some consulting with businesses around their mental health and all kind of stuff. I was floored by how many people who reached out. And it wasn't the kind of thing where, you know, a couple of them turned into actual paying clients, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was just to be there for people who were going, I don't know how to process what's going on in my life right now. And, you know, for about a month, that's all I did with the podcast because I was still ramping that up and just being on Zoom, on the phone with people who just needed to chat, needed to complain and needed someone to listen and not judge them. And so my spring was just being there for people. And it was a really fantastic reminder of, number one, why I do what I do. But number two, sort of we're all in this together because nobody had the answers. Nobody was saying, here's how this is going to work. And anyone who told us that they knew what the future held was flat out lying to us. So, you know, there was a lot of just needing to sit with our emotions and talk to people who understood what we were going through. And that's what my entire spring was this year.
Well, I'm interested to learn when those people did call, what did they want to know? What did they want to share? Or did they just kind of want to be heard about their fears?
Oh yeah, it was definitely mostly the latter. A lot of people just wanting someone to listen, to validate what they were feeling was understandable and okay. I can't tell you how many people said things like, you know, I'm still annoyed with my coworker who's doing this. You know, this is before everybody transitioned to virtual. Is it okay to still be upset about these things that clearly don't really matter, but are still getting on my nerves. And yes, just because we have this giant thing going on doesn't mean that our everyday life is going to disappear. And so, there definitely were people not being sure that they were allowed to feel certain ways, or can I complain that my job is annoying when other people are losing their jobs? And so there was a lot of this tightrope walking that, as long as you are doing it in a healthy way, I think it's okay to feel how you feel and to sit with those emotions and both recognize, yes, there are people who are losing their jobs, but also I still feel this way about mine. And that was a lot of it, was just being there and listening to people and validating them and not judging them.
I want to get back into some of the core issues here in a couple of moments, core issues regarding mental health and wellness. But before we do that, let me kind of back up just a bit and help lay the foundation for your background. It's people may be listening or watching our video version of this conversation and saying, well, who is Jay? Why does he get to speak about this topic? So what's your background in all of this, and how did you come into actually starting a podcast about mental wellness?
Oh man, who is Jay, right? That's a question for the philosophers. Who are we? My story is sort of a long and winding road, as the Beatles sang. I was diagnosed with ADHD as a preteen back in the 90s, and this was sort of when the great ADHD awakening was happening in our country. And at the time, a lot of these drugs that we were trying out on kids, they had side effects. We knew that all medication has side effects. But unfortunately, a lot of the knowledge of these side effects wasn't as acted upon as it is today. And, I was a preteen, and we all remember the joys of going through puberty, right? And on top of that, I've got some underlying mental health things, as most people do. I've struggled with depression and anxiety most of my life. I have OCD. And so you take those pieces and you mix it with then now high levels of chemicals as a teenager, and it's going to create some side effects, right? We're going to see some bumps in the road. Well, unfortunately for me, my therapist saw these bumps in the road and said, instead of recognizing this sort of perfect storm that he helped create, he diagnosed those signs as bigger issues, as warning signs for what he later described as bipolar disorder. Now, fast forward, we know that was a misdiagnosis. Now, unfortunately, that wasn't the case, back in the 90s. So I lived with that hanging over me for almost a decade. And by my early 20s, I was both mentally and physically addicted to my medications that he had put me on, both for the ADHD, but more for the bipolar disorder. And in my early 20s, I attempted suicide twice. I overdosed. I spent time in a lockdown unit. I spent time in a long-term care facility, what we would have called a mental institution 50 years ago, before realizing, finally having my awakening, that I'd been misdiagnosed, and what I was struggling with was substance misuse and not, mental health issues, although the two obviously go hand in hand. And so I checked myself out, went through detox, and eventually, entered recovery, where I have now been happily in recovery for almost 11 years. And after that, went back to school, got my degree in psychology, because I was so curious as to what had gone on inside my own head during this period. And really, honestly, how could someone do what they did to me with that misdiagnosis and the overprescribing and all that kind of stuff? Went from there to get a bunch of certifications in mental health first aid and all sorts of stuff, and was doing this on the side for the last 6 or 7 years. Started speaking in 2015. I've been doing that now for going on 6 years. And in 2019, left my career behind to do this full time. And so since then, I've been doing speaking and coaching and consulting, which was my past career, but I pivoted towards mental health and substance misuse. And now the podcast and a lot of writing. And, honestly, it comes down to, I'm getting a second chance in a world where most people don't get their first. And if I don't do something good with this, if I don't use this second chance to make a real difference around these issues, then I'd be wasting it.
You mentioned that one of your motivations for going back to school was to find out what was going on inside your head. And I'm reminded of a passage in the Bible where the Apostle Paul says, why do I do the things I don't want to do and I don't do the things that I want to do? Basically what is going on? I mention that because I think that this journey, this struggle has been around for as long as humans have been around, trying to figure out what makes us tick and why sometimes when we tick, the clock seems to be out of rhythm, out of sync. What did you find out about, in that journey? Did you find answers to what's going on inside my head?
Well, I learned a lot, and I've always been curious in sort of the human condition, as we call it. But I think the most important thing that we're now learning is that everybody, we used to think of mental health as a black and white thing, as we do with a lot of things in our society, right? Either good or bad, red or blue, whatever the case is. With mental health, it's a spectrum. Nobody is all the way on one end. And there's no healthy camp and unhealthy. That's just not how this works. And it most profound to me, I think the greatest example is I was reading an article in Psychology Today, probably about a month or two ago, that we're now starting to treat people with what we used to call borderline personality disorder the same way we do with diagnoses of bigger personality issues. And that is because they're starting to realize that if somebody is 99% the same as someone in this camp, why would we treat them differently just because they're missing that 1%? And so we're starting to see that in how we regard mental health, is that it is not a black and white issue. It is not, here you have an issue, this place you don't. It's okay. Where do you spend most of your time on this spectrum? And if there are issues that come from that, how are we going to treat that in a healthy way?
Our guest here on The Big Impact is Jay Shifman. His podcast is called the Choose Your Struggle podcast. And I haven't asked you this yet, Jay. What's the name all about? What does Choose Your Struggle mean?
Yeah, so Choose Your Struggle is my company. It's my personal brand. It's my podcast, as you said. And essentially it boils down to this. When I was at my worst, which is, as I said, this was 2008, 2009, and 2010, when I did attempt suicide, when I overdosed. During that period, I had lost the ability to sort of choose what I was going to struggle for every day, right? Getting off the couch, quite frankly, avoiding withdrawals, those were my biggest struggles. And if anyone listening has ever gone through withdrawals, you know how important trying to avoid those are. It is a huge struggle. Once I entered recovery, I realized that, yes, I had lost that ability in sort of the most profound way possible. I allowed these substances and my misuse of these substances to steal my choices from me. But there are other people who are doing that every day on much larger or smaller scales. Whether it's, you're in a career that you hate because 20 years ago, mommy or daddy said, hey, you're going to be a doctor, and you became a doctor. Or you're following this idea of what success looks like that's based on nothing, right? It's our society teaches us a lot of times to kind of chase the wrong things in life, right? Get a lot of money, get the big house, the promotion. None of that really makes you happy at the end of the day, unless that is literally what you care about in life. Excuse me. So essentially it boils down to that, make sure that you are chasing what is going to make you happy. Choose your struggle in life and don't let it get chosen for you.
Well, life certainly has enough opportunity for us to find plenty of things to worry about. And those things that we can control seem like a much wiser investment of our time. I can control some things. Even in 2020, I can control some things. For instance, I can control how I react to difficulty. I may not be able to stop the pandemic on my own. I can't. I've tried. It doesn't work. But what if I can keep it from making me miserable? What if instead of shutting down and feeling like the world is caving in, I realize this is one of those golden opportunities to sort of reset from a professional and personal and family standpoint, some priorities in the way that we spend our time. Maybe it's just an improvement in the way we do things technically. For instance, Jay, you and I are talking on Zoom. Before the pandemic, I really didn't know what Zoom was. Now I wish I'd bought stock in it because I would be quite a bit ahead of the game. And all of these things that come along, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's some other challenge, there is an opportunity to grow through it. Can you kind of help lead us along that thought process? Because there are a lot of people right now, and I'm not demeaning or making light of in any way their challenges. There are people who've lost jobs, who have no idea how they're going to pay next month's bills or eventually when they come due. These can be very difficult things to work through, but there is an opportunity to work through them. What would you say if you were speaking to a group of folks with that issue right now?
I definitely say that. Just thinking about that, my heart it aches for people who have had their entire world turned upside down this year, and I can't. I am so privileged that I never have to worry about where my next meal is going to come from. I never have to worry about losing the roof over my head. Even though this year has been very hard on my business, my wife still makes great money. And she and I and our dog are perfectly fine and perfectly happy. So I feel so strongly for those people who cannot say that. To your question, though, you make such a great point, and that's something that I work on with clients when I'm coaching, is that we have a choice in how we deal with the things that are thrown our way. And it gets back to one of my early points, which was that when I saw how tough this year was going to be, like I said, I lost a good amount of money from those speaking engagements in 2 days. 5 of them just gone. And I took a couple of days to go, wow, this is going to be a really tough year. And then I got back up and I pivoted and I started doing what was going to make me happy again, which was helping others, being there for others. Like I said, I was really lucky to start the podcast when I saw the writing on the wall. And so in those moments, you have a choice as to how you're going to deal with this. Quite frankly, I could have rolled over and gone, this year is going to be terrible. I should take whatever job I can because my business is clearly over. And I will credit my wife there. There were a couple of days where I went, oh my God, is this worth it? Should I keep, and she had to remind me, you're doing a great thing. The money, don't worry about that right now. Everyone's hurting. What you are doing is more important than money. And so when I get off my focus, and yes, even I, who preach this, I get off that focus sometimes. I'm very lucky that I have my wife there to go, remember why you're doing that.
I'm glad you mentioned having your wife by your side, because there are so many people who are feeling isolated as if no one is on their side. I remember a few months ago, my pastor made the statement from the platform that we are the most socially connected culture in history, but we are also the most isolated. We've shut down and disappeared into our tablets and screens. And when troubling times come along, we then haven't necessarily built up this network of support of people who would come along and say, hey, it's going to be okay. And Jay, I hearken back to you mentioning that you tried to take your own life a couple times. And when those moments came along, I'm guessing that it was because you thought you were all alone in the struggle.
Yeah, I did. And there were two real keys that contributed towards me attempting suicide. And that's number one, as you perfectly said, I felt very alone. I didn't feel that there was anyone there for me. The people that I was surrounded with, they weren't bad people. The only thing we had in common, though, is that we were all, misusing substances together. So that's number one. Number two, was that I lost hope. And I've been given this misdiagnosis. I've been given this label now for almost a decade. And when I looked around and saw other people with similar diagnoses getting better, and I didn't, I lost hope. And I understand why that is. If 1 + 1 normally equals 2, and for me it was -1, you're not going to challenge the equation. A therapist gave me that equation. I wasn't challenging it. I just lost hope that I could be someone who got better. Now, that piece is a lot harder to fix. One of the things I preach, and I talk about this all the time, is, make sure you're getting second, third, fourth diagnoses when it comes to your mental health. I give the example, my aunt has been battling cancer for the last year, and every time that she gets a recommendation for her treatment, she goes and gets a second or third or fourth opinion. And because of that, she's gotten the best treatment possible. And yet, when I got this incredibly life-changing diagnosis, this label that would follow me for the rest of my life, we just said, okay, that's the way it is. So we didn't go get a second opinion. That's also a lot harder to change. The connection piece, as you perfectly said, we are so connected. And part of that means that there are communities for everybody. You just have to find them. Yes, there's a lot of bad things about social media, and we could do a whole nother show about the ills of social media. But one thing it does do is it means that there are communities for everything, whether you are into, bird watching or autograph collecting, or whatever the case is. You can find a community of that group of people online. You just have to go looking for it. And something that I say whenever I speak is, if you are in a position where you truly believe there's nobody out there for you, first off, I guarantee you you're wrong. As someone who was in that position, I guarantee you you're wrong. I was wrong then. You're probably wrong now. But if you truly believe that way and you don't think there's anyone left for you to talk to, reach out to me and I'll be there for you. Find me on my website. You can find me on social media. Whatever the case is, if you need someone to talk, I will be there. Reach out. As we say in this, those of us who do this work, we'd rather spend 2 hours talking to you today than 2 hours at your funeral tomorrow. So please reach out.
Yeah. By the way, that website is jayshifman.com, JAYSHIFMAN. And we'll continue talking with Jay Shifman after this on The Big Impact. Our guest here on The Big Impact is Jay Shifman. He is the host of the Choose Your Struggle podcast, a speaker dealing with mental health issues. And Jay, like so many other speakers these days, myself included, it's been a weird year where people have said, we still want you to speak, but could you do it in Zoom for 30 people? And you're like, we can give it a try. I can do it, but will they be alive at the end and paying attention? That's a different story altogether. So I'm glad you started the podcast. If there's one thing that I've learned over the past 4 years of having a podcast network, is that being able to deliver content when people want to consume it is really popular. And I noticed that from the Choose Your Struggle podcast, that you've actually attracted an audience from all over the world, not just here in America. These issues really are worldwide. They really are global. Unsettledness, depression, sadness. This pandemic is not just an American issue. This is everywhere. What are you learning from those who are reaching out to you from other countries and other cultures? Because we do tend to view things. I mean, let's face it, we tend to view things only through the prism of being an American, but this is everywhere.
Yeah, it's such a tough question. I'm really lucky that my podcast is worldly. It's been streamed in over 35 countries, and almost half the listens are around the rest of the world. It's big in some traditional sort of shared ideas, countries like England, France, things like that. But the most impactful feedback I get are from countries that you wouldn't normally think about. There was a couple people who reached out from Asia. I had a young man reach out from Northern Africa, and he said, one of the reasons I love your show is that it talks about issues that we don't get to hear about where I live. And that honestly floored me. It just, to have this impact, to be able to freely talk about these issues and change somebody's life, the entire world away, it meant so much to me that he reached out and said that. So, what's so amazing, though, is making these connections. There's a young woman currently in the hospital in England who I've been conversing with. She reached out because she found my podcast and loved it, and we have developed a friendship. And I'm so thankful for these people who are quite honestly teaching me, because as you so perfectly said, my experience with this is American. I was in the hospital here in America. I have tried to learn as much as I can about how our country has treated people, with my background in America. And so learning about this from other viewpoints and just other experiences has been absolutely world changing for me. And it's one of those things I hearken back on. It's the second time I'm going to reference the Beatles here in the show, but I'm a big Beatles fan, and George Harrison once sang, "The farther one travels, the less one knows." And it's true. The more that I talk with people who have very different experiences than mine, the more it helps me understand that I don't know everything and I don't know anything really. And all I know is what I've focused on. And I'm very thankful when people take the time to help me learn.
Well, I think also one of the attractive qualities of the Choose Your Struggle podcast is that you occasionally bring in guests from around different sectors of life. We like to do that here. That's why you're on this program with me. And I would love to learn what you've gleaned from some of the guests that you have had on. For instance, an ultra marathoner by the name of Greg Nance. Now, this is a level of athletic endeavor and commitment that blows the minds of most people. It's not just a marathoner, it's an ultra marathoner. You can define what that is. And then more importantly, what did you learn from a guy who commits to that degree?
Yeah, Greg was a really interesting chat. So he gained a small level of fame last year when he became the first American to complete the 7 marathons in 7 continents in 7 days challenge, which is unreal to me.
Crazy.
Yeah. And here's the even more ridiculous thing is he did it while struggling with substance misuse and he didn't tell anyone. And so that's where we connected. Now, I think, you and Greg would probably have a really great chat because he honestly cites his faith as what got him through. And as a person who's not really that religious, that was something that was really interesting to me. And he is so thankful for that part of his life, the faith that got him through this experience. Because you imagine, look, I love to run. It's my exercise as well. I've done a half marathon and that for me was enough. Here's a guy who's running hundreds of miles a day, 7 days. I mean, it's mind boggling, right? And doing that while also struggling with substance misuse is extra mind boggling. And so you have to have something on top of that to get you through. And for Greg, that was his faith. And so he was really an interesting guy to chat with. And he's been a guy that I've been following for a while. I learned about him through somebody else, and we finally connected. And he's been a great guy to learn from. And you're right. I've had such amazing guests this year. There are days where I'm like, how did I get to talk to this person?
Well, the addiction doctor, Rob Kelly, was one of your guests, and I have to think that was a pretty popular episode. If for no other reason, then he's a pretty well-known man and name, but he also brings to the table a level of knowledge of all of this that us mere mortals don't normally possess. So what'd you learn from Rob?
Yeah. Rob Kelly, or as he is known, the Gordon Ramsay of recovery, because he and Gordon Ramsay are friends. He has the same sort of brash style. He's his convictions are very strong. He speaks with a lot of energy, and you can see him on every morning show. He's that guy, and he was really interesting to talk to because he takes a very cool approach to recovery. It's a very hands-on. Imagine again Gordon Ramsay in his kitchen, except instead of food, we're talking about the recovery of people's lives,
screaming at you.
Yes, except that he's screaming from love. It's not screaming because you're a piece of trash or whatever the case is. It's screaming, you can do this. I believe in you, and in your face with all that intensity. Thinking back to when I was at my worst, that would have worked for me. So, learning from him was really fascinating.
One of the sectors of professional life that always fascinates me, and I end up listening to a lot of interviews with comedians. I've really come to appreciate how tortured many of them are in their souls. They really are. I mean, this is the humor that they bring to us on the platform oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, switches off the moment they leave the stage and the darkness returns. You visited with comedian Frank King. Did you pick that up in him? Is he like many of his colleagues?
Yeah. So comedy is a thing that's run through my life for a long time. My best friend for the last 20 years is a comedian living in Chicago named Spark Tabor. My brother is a comic writer. And one of my greatest heroes in life, actually sitting right next to me here, is a signed autograph from Robin Williams. So really just a big comedy fan. So getting to chat with Frank was incredible because Frank has worked with all of them. He's worked with Robin. He wrote for Leno. He went on tour with Jeff Foxworthy and those guys. So, Frank was a guy that again, one of those moments of how am I talking to this person, yes, you're right. And Frank is very upfront about that. In fact, he talks about how, that a lot of that is a coping mechanism. And, he is a guy who so interestingly has devoted his sort of second act in life to raising the awareness around suicide and talking about his own struggles with suicide. And, he is one of those guys. He could have kept going and made a lot of money being the comedian Frank King, and as he was doing really well for himself. But he decided, you know what, I have this platform, I have this ability to talk about something more important, and I'm going to do that. And he's a guy I look up to a lot. I was on his podcast, he was on mine. We chat every couple of weeks or just to connect and see how we're doing. And he's a guy who definitely has been an amazing mentor to me.
Boy, you brought up the name Robin Williams, and for a lot of people in our audience, it's still a head shaker to try to figure out how all of that transpired. And for, by way of reminder for everybody listening, Robin took his own life, and this was the guy that no comedian ever wanted to follow on the stage. They'll talk about being at the Comedy Store, at the Improv in LA, and it's midnight and it's just about time for their set, and in the back door walks Robin Williams, and you're like, oh no, he's going right on the stage because he's Robin Williams. And that means I got to go next. And I've heard very popular, very well-known comedians say he went up there and for 15 minutes, he burned the house down, and then it was like, my turn.
Yeah.
And nobody wants that. And, I just for whatever reason, I got into a YouTube dive the other day, and I was watching Robin's final appearances on Letterman and on Johnny Carson. I'm old, right? On Johnny Carson. He was on Johnny's second to last show and just brought the place to its knees. It's so hard to wrap our heads around the darkness that then enveloped Robin in those times when he was by himself. He had a family, but he was by himself. And it doesn't make sense. From a logical standpoint, it doesn't make sense. And I'm wondering if you can help us kind of learn how to connect the dots between logical and depression, because those two things don't often go together.
No, they don't. You're right. And I think that's such a beautiful point, is that the logical piece sort of goes out the window. And by the way, I'm like you. When I need a pick-me-up, I immediately go to YouTube and start watching Robin Williams videos. And he has been my hero for a long time. When I was in the long-term care facility, it was when he released his last stand-up special. This was 2009. Obviously, we didn't know it was going to be his last special at the time. And he is a hero to a lot of us in the mental health and substance misuse community, because he was so open with his struggles with mental health and substance misuse. And so when he lost his battle, it was like a piece of us all lost our battles, because here was a guy that, like you said, seemed like, okay, if he's winning, he's beaten these things, and then he lost. And it was also a reminder that this is a constant struggle. There is no graduation. There's no remission of these things. They go away, they come back, and they're always something you have to be working on. Now with Robin, we also learned late in his life he was developing some dementia-like illnesses, and to see there's an amazing book about him that came out about a year or two ago. It was a biography with all the people in his life, Billy Crystal, Whoopi Goldberg, all these people contributed this book, and it was incredible. And it really helps you understand, for a guy like Robin, who was never the biggest, never the strongest, had the best, quickest brain, of ever there was, right? And that's what he was so amazing at, was having this ability to go from here to here, and just in a way that made you laugh. For that to start being diminished would be like an athlete who all of a sudden lost a step. And it must have been absolutely agonizing to him. And so when you see that, and you see there's no hope of that coming back, sort of going back to my experience, I saw everybody else with my diagnosis getting better, and I didn't. It's easy to lose hope. And from what I've read, and from what I've heard from people who are close to him, that was what was happening in Robin's mind, is that he saw no future for himself. He saw no path forward, and he lost that hope. And I feel for that, because obviously in that moment, it was hard for him to remember that there were literally millions of people who held him to the highest regard. I mean, obviously, I consider myself a super fan, but everyone was a fan. Whether you loved, Aladdin, or you loved Mrs. Doubtfire, or I have a baseball sitting here signed by Carlton Fisk, inscribed "I got to go see about a girl," because that's Robin Williams' classic line about the Carlton Fisk home run in Good Will Hunting, which I think is one of the best movies ever made. Robin was just such an incredible actor, but in that moment of hopelessness, he forgot that there were so many people out there, or maybe it didn't matter. It's really hard to say. And it was a tragic loss. I remember where I was when I found out. It was that big of a moment.
Well, it's also a good note for us to sort of wind down on it, and here's why. If Robin Williams can feel alone in the midst of millions of fans, then it's entirely possible that somebody listening to us right now feels alone, even in the midst of a loving family. And so, Jay, you and I together are kind of closing out 2020, and we're talking about a reset for 2021. I'm going to kind of give you the final word as we talk about reset from a mental wellness standpoint. What would you like someone in our audience to know who's really just struggling to feel like they matter and that they want to be around for 2021?
Well, as we talked about earlier, reaching out is so important. But there's one aspect of this that I think is incredibly prescient. And there was a study done that came out about a week ago. And the headline was "Blaming 2020 for the way you feel this year is bad for your mental health." And essentially what the study showed was that people who are, saying things like, "Oh, well, it's going to be better next year," are basically setting themselves up for disappointment, because things aren't going to go back to quote unquote normal, right? I mean, what does new normal look like? We have no idea at this point. And a lot of what this article was trying to press was that we have to be preparing ourselves personally. We have to be, as you and I talked about earlier, pivoting and embracing these little choices that we have every day, choosing our struggle as I talk about. And what that boils down to is, again, as you perfectly said earlier, it's figuring out the little things that we can do every day to bring that back into our wheelhouse and decide what we're going to do going forward. And if we keep saying, okay, I know this year has been horrible, but 2021 is going to be better. I mean, we all hope so, right? But we really don't know. There's no guarantee yet that 2021 is going to be that much better. And so if we just sit back and, I'm a baseball guy, so I always think back of the old adage, you have to charge the ball. If you sit back and let it come to you, it's probably going to be too late by the time you swing it over to first base. So instead, you run towards the ball, you make sure you are controlling what's happening on the infield, and you throw that ball over to first base. So charge the ball, be ready for whatever comes your way, and make those small choices yourself, because we're all in this thing together, and none of us knows how this is going to turn out.
The podcast is called the Choose Your Struggle podcast. It is available everywhere podcasts are found, and you can go to jayshifman.com. That's SHIFMAN.com for more information. And when the day does come again that we can travel and go and do things like speak to groups, I'm sure Jay would be happy to come and speak to your group. I really appreciate your insight. It's been great to get to know you through these last few minutes of an interview. It's an important issue you're addressing, and I hope that it continues to go well for you, man. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Bill, and maybe one day we can share a stage together when we get to be all in person again.
I'm in, man. I am all in. I will even comb my hair.
Well, thank you.